3.5 Rikatos, 7 months, Sturk shouted. It took you guys that long to find a cure? Foof couldn't resist such an opportunity, especially since it was Sturk. Actually, we figured out a cure a couple of Riktos 4 days after you were put in cryostasis, but it was so nice without your constant mindless yakking that we only just now decided that it would have been immoral to keep you frozen any longer, despite our desires. Sturk whipped around, staring at Foof with wide, hurt eyes. Foof could hardly contain his laughter. The moron actually believes me. Shut up, Foof, snapped Sturk. Of course we didn't leave you in there for the fun of it, Sturk. Foof was taken out a mere Rick 30 minutes ago. Sturk, oddly enough, was correct in one respect. 3.5 Rikatos, 7 months, was a ridiculous amount of time to spend on the cure for a single disease, especially with the equipment of a Category 10 medical station at one's disposal. It made more sense when she reminded herself that it had not actually been just one disease. The crew had, in fact, displayed the symptoms of 5 different contagions, and that wasn't mentioning the dormant antigens which had been discovered upon a more thorough examination of the first crew members thought to have been cured. Such sleeper diseases had numbered in the dozens, and taken the longest to completely eradicate. To ensure that absolutely nothing harmful remained, the entire station and the cargo ship had undergone a full sanitation. In total, the time required to undo what Kukututu had unwittingly managed in a mere Riktos, 2 days, had required a full 3.5 Rikatos, 7 months. In that entire time, Zerk had not contracted a single disease, purely out of good luck it seemed. That only meant she had to bide her time through the entire ordeal, with nothing to distract her from her anger. Even now, after time had quenched the initial inferno, it still fled to life every time her eyes lit upon Dr. Triv. That lying, manipulative, two-faced, courty bastard! He had been able to communicate with Kukututu, and had intentionally remained silent regarding his ability so that he would have no inconvenient moral or illegal obstacles when studying Kukututu's physiology without his consent. Worse yet, she had caught him. She had heard Kukututu speaking intelligible clicks, seen him speaking to Dr. Triv, and the courty scum had the nerve to tell her that she had been imagining things. Of course, the surveillance footage from that room just happened to have been corrupted. Worse yet, Dr. Triv had somehow convinced Kukututu of some Robolin resurgence, sending him off to who knows where, never to be seen or heard from again. Of course, the courtier had shown her the surveillance records, which appeared rather convincing, but she didn't intend to trust this ward of a creature any farther than she could throw him. Admittedly, given the doctor's stature and her current feelings towards him, that distance might be somewhat greater than she would have anticipated if she had a mind to find out. She still hadn't decided whether or not she did. Sturk had to choose that very moment to speak. He always seemed to have the worst timing with the worst questions. Hey, where's Kukututu? He's the one who put me in here. The least he could have done was be here to apologize, or I guess in his case look sorry. He left, Zerk whispered. She didn't really believe Kukututu had been fooled by the courtier. He had been intelligent. She still hated how long it had taken her to realize, but more surprisingly, he had truly cared for her and the rest of the crew. She suspected he had left in an effort to protect the crew, not realizing his world's deadly microbes had been contained. What confirmed this theory in her mind was the vial of blood he had left. He hadn't been willing to give so much as a drop to anyone during his entire stay, but when he had known he was leaving, he had left her the key to creating the cure. She knew in her mind Kukututu was most likely dead, either from starvation or some twisted ploy, but despite her cynicalism, she still hoped that, wherever Kukututu was, he was safe and happy. Lieutenant Colonel Bravek ducked. The anti-tank kinetic pulse narrowly missed his head, flashing by close enough to ruffle the fur on his head and back. It was a good thing he had, too. He didn't think his personal shield would be able to take another shot. His momentary union with the ground gave his mind a few precious moments to consider the battle around him. It wasn't good. He'd never seen a fight with so many vehicles, and that was saying something. Coming from him. He was one of the most experienced of the 74th, and had been to Hell and back several times. Now, Hell apparently had tiers, and he was several levels lower than he'd ever been before. Major Clip slid down the short declivity next to where Blavik was taking a momentary rest. "We can't stay here long, sir," he panted. "The moment they decide they don't want to bother trying to shoot us out of cover, they're going to point the nearest tank squad in our direction, and I don't think the guys can take on another one." Blavik snorted humorously. Another tank squadron. Before today, his squad had only ever taken on 2 or 3 tanks at a time. It spoke to the superb skill of his men that they had managed to defeat such odds with only minor casualties, but now they had far outstripped any previous record they may have set. Today they managed to survive not one, nor two, but 3 attacks by 4 tank squadrons, and miraculously emerged alive and victorious. Well, a few of them were alive. Casualties had never been so heavy, but neither had the odds been so heavily against them. The 74th may have contained the finest soldier in the Dominion, and his men arguably the greatest among them, but when the enemy had as many armoured squadrons as the 74th did of infantry, there was little they could do, finest soldiers or not. If the Hes hadn't had the foresight to send the 32nd and the 13th Armoured Divisions to provide support, this battle would have already been over. Even though he already knew the answer, Blagfek decided to ask Clip, hoping his gut was wrong for the first time. How are the 32nd and 13th holding up? Clip grimaced. Poorly, maybe even worse than us. At least we can dive into holes when it gets too hot. Those poor bastards are stuck in big hulks of metal with the colours of the Dominion painted all over their sides. They're impossible to miss even in this mess. Our call shot narrowly missed their position, its sickly red light replacing the ashen cast of the battlefield for a split second before it impacted a short distance to the left of their hiding place, turning a hill into a hole. Bloodfed whipped his head around, searching for the source of the disturbance. A burning husk sat where a rover had once hovered. Just a shot fired in the brief moment before extinction. Breathing a sigh of relief that they weren't under attack just yet, Bloodfed consulted his gut. It was the main reason he was still alive. He had a sense about the battlefield. He could feel when a turning point was at hand, even though nothing seemed to have changed. His ability had led his men out of more than one tough scrape, but now he felt the current situation was one even his gut couldn't help him out of. It seemed to be sobbing in despair, which did nothing to bolster his flagging internal morale. It was only his internal morale which was affected, however. He never let his fear show in his face. That would have admitted true defeat. He had to help his men. He had to give them something to fight, so that, when the time came, they could die like men, standing up, rather than frightened prey hiding in their holes, hoping the predator wouldn't find them. Searching about the battlefield with his eyes, he calmly and calculatingly scanned for anything he could exploit, anything that would give him and his men more opportunities, if not for survival, then at least for a more meaningful death. It was as he looked that the predator decided to show up. It just wasn't the predator he would have expected. Sir, get down! Clip shouted in warning, but he didn't need it. He'd sensed the approaching danger, although, as always, he couldn't explain how, especially through all the mayhem of the fighting around him. To his right, a small group of enemy rovers were powering towards his position. Their trajectory suggested they had nearly come from behind his position. Have we been beaten back so far already? Shouldering his anti-tank pulse guns with his first 4 arms, and his fusion spears in the other 2, he prepared to engage the approaching onslaught. A figure on top of one of the rovers caught his eye at the last moment. Holding 2 fusion scythes and caterwauling like a banshee, a small creature Bloodfake had never seen before rode atop the foremost rover, as though it were a steed, howling in a language that, for some reason, his translator didn't understand. It was covered in blood from various species, completely obscuring the colours of allegiance on his harness. He was still staring at the odd little biped when the rovers whipped past their position without giving his squad a second glance. Clip snapped him from his reverie. Are those drivers wearing some of our combat harnesses? Blafek hadn't even realised, so engrossed he had been with the odd spectacle above the hovercraft, but Clip was right. Ensconced within the rovers as they were, it was impossible to see unless one was as close as he was, but Blafek could clearly see the colours of the Dominion on the harnesses of the soldiers and the rovers. At first he was repulsed by such a sight. How could they? They were ignoring the rules of honourable combat. They were blatantly lying about their allegiance so as to avoid notice by the enemy. It was despicable. Deplorable. Ingenious. Even as he stared in shock, the duplicitous convoy approached the position of the troops that were keeping his unit pinned down. Not a shot was fired upon them. After all, to the Celsi down the range, they were on the same team. Then their own team opened fire on them. The first volley was devastating, each craft firing every cannon simultaneously, bathing the entrenchment in their deadly light. There wasn't much left after that first volley, except a deeper hole. Bloodfeg knew he should feel outraged by the blatant disregard of the rules of honourable combat, but at the moment, the only one he was furious with was himself for allowing these idiotic laws to make him completely disregard such a plainly effective idea. Cursing himself for his slow wits, he turned to Clip. I want you to find any in the area. Tell them to get into an enemy vehicle at all costs. We're going to win this battle one way or the other. Propriety can go bother dusty men from wars long over. Wait, you want to emulate them? Cried Clip. They're ignoring every principle of the very foundation of civilized war. And they're kicking some serious ass because of it, retorted Blythek, gesturing to the small group as it approached a squad of tanks from behind. They opened fire in much the same manner as they had against the enemy infantry entrenchment, to much the same effect. Any other Celsi units around them were embroiled in their own conflicts, and were far too busy to notice that a few of their number were acting in a decidedly unpatriotic manner. His point proven, Bloodfeck returned his attention to Clip, who appeared quite impressed despite himself. And don't start spouting that drivel about civilized war. If you can see what's right in front of you, and still talk such nonsense, you've got shit for brains. Now find anyone you can in the immediate area and tell them to hijack enemy vehicles at all costs. If they don't, they'll die anyway. Turning his back on a spluttering Clip, Bloodfeck dashed to the nearest hole which housed a cluster of his few remaining men. As a smile spread across his face, he realized just how much he had hated those imbecilic rules. Dear Journal, I'm a military genius. I guess that just comes naturally with being a strategic genius. Really, outer space does a lot for a guy's self-image. I'd never felt so terribly alive before. Riding my glorious metal steed, I raised my lava scimitars above my head, shouting in pure exhilaration. That was about all I was doing. Really, my squad mates were doing all the work. First time for everything, I guess. If only they wouldn't shoot from so far away. Drive me closer! I want to hit them with my swords! They didn't oblige. I poked my head through a window which no longer can contain glass, preparing an inappropriate and exasperating quip to throw at Mathiol, upon whose hover-hummer I was riding. That's when I noticed his expression. His face held the unmistakable expression of one who could not believe what he was doing. Judging by his driving, I couldn't believe he had managed to keep us out a nasty wreck so far either, but that didn't explain why Kresh in the next vehicle over had the same shocked look on his face. That guy handled his hover-hummer like a pro, yet he still looked like he'd just let out an involuntary laugh during the scene where Old Yeller dies. In fact, now that I was looking for it, every single one of my squad looked disturbed by their actions. Maybe they were just surprised they were still alive. Frankly, I was. I hadn't thought our little tactic of hijacking enemy hover-hummers would have been so effective, but it was like we were invisible to the enemy. Every time we approached an opposing squadron, I was sure someone would notice our odd behavior and open fire, but each time we would manage to get into firing range, destroying them before they even had a chance to retaliate. Our naturally good luck couldn't last us through the entire battle, could it? Yeah, I actually let my mind conceive such a traitorous thought. I need to see those before they happen and nip them in the bud, because one of these days I'm going to think myself to death. Right on cue, as though it had sensed a being who dared conceive a hopeful thought, a dragon pierced through the veil that had been protecting us thus far. I don't know what was up with the dragons in this battle, but they were far out flying through the air. Through my other encounters with these overgrown lizards, I'd eventually realised that their wings were more or less just for show than actual use. Sure, they provided another appendage with which to attack me, and made coming at them from the side a downright pain, but the most flying I'd ever seen them use their wings for was a short gliding extension to their jumps. Their wings were about as effective as a flying squirrel's. Not these dragons, though. Apparently they had found the same source of leprechaun farts and pixie tears that planes used, because they were taken to sky with great sweeps of their wings. Well, now that I looked at them, they seemed to be working pretty hard to stay up for long, but they were up nonetheless. One of the devils had noticed our little convoy from above. Folding his wings, the Drake rolled into a dive. With the low gravity of this planet, its rate of descent seemed slowed enough to appear comical, but it would still have enough momentum to be deadly when it reached us. Just to sweeten the deal, it was heading straight for my hover-hummer. As it approached, I found myself, rather than frightened, excited. Finally, some action. Wait, had I really just thought that? Where did that come from? I've got a fucking dragon barreling down at me and I'm excited? Am I insane? The dragon was fast approaching, so I stowed this newest development for later. How I was going to deal with this thing coming down on me. My mind, demonstrating more of my newfound manners, presented me with a course of action straight out of Die Hard. Well, close enough. You've got to be kidding, I groaned, but I couldn't think of any other way. Let's just say I'm not a clever man. I waited a single moment more, allowing the beast to close within a mere 20 meters of our craft. Then I jumped. Bloodfeck knew he shouldn't enjoy something as grisly as war, but he couldn't help himself. He was actually having fun. Careening about the battlefield in his recently acquired tank, he and a sizable group of other stolen vehicles were, for the first time that day, making headway against a seemingly endless tide of enemies. Perhaps that small convoy of rovers had been able to hide underneath their assumed colours undetected, but a group as large as the one which followed Bloodfeck, which was still growing as more vehicles changed hands, had been able to run rampant for long before they had started being noticed. Bloodfeck could feel the rage of the Celsi as they realised the treachery the Dominion had committed in the name of victory. Bloodfeck had come up with a new motto, however, which perfectly characterised his feelings since bucking the old ways. All is fair in war. Maybe he'd become famous for it. He had to admit, as brilliant as the plan had been, he didn't think any other division would have been able to pull it off. Nowhere else would you find a group with so many soldiers able to fight against vehicles and win, albeit with difficulty. You probably wouldn't have found so many infantrymen who knew how to drive the vehicles either. This was the 74th, though, and now that they had a fighting chance, they were demonstrating why they were the only division left from the original Dominion army. Turning to Gisept, who was manning the main cannon, Bloodfeck shouted over the tumultuous roar inside the tank. "How are our little upstarts doing?" "Still up and kicking," the heavy replied with a grin. "They're going to have to turn back to us soon, though. The Celsi will eventually get everyone on the same page, and then they won't have their surprise factor anymore, which is the only reason they've made it so far. They're a little ways away, though. I don't think if they'll be able to—" Shit! Bloodfeck's heart sank at the defeated tone of Giesep's expletive. It was a tone he'd heard far too often today. The tone of one who is about to see another die and knows there's nothing they can do to stop it. Giesep continued. "A Volzer just spotted them, and it's time to intercept—" Shit! That wasn't a tone he'd been expecting. Bloodfeck took his eyes off the road ahead and looked in the general direction of where he had last seen the inspiration for the current operating orders. He was just in time to see the little creature that had been standing on top of one of the rovers jump off of the corpse of a Volzer, which seemed to have died mid-flight, and hit the ground with a roll, leaving the dragon to slam into the ground behind it. The small creature didn't even look impressed with his handiwork, neglecting to even glance at the downed monster it had just slain, in an impossible manner. Holy fuck! It worked! I couldn't believe it. I'd actually managed to jump on its head, stab it in the skull, then jump off it and roll to safety before it could drag me into a collision I doubted I'd survive. I wanted to jump up and down and squeal like a little girl while flapping my arms, but I had an audience. The occupants of Hover Hummer 3 were watching with a shocked expression I hadn't seen in months. Hunching my shoulders, I set my entire will to forcing myself to avoid looking back at my kill, reminding myself of the first law of any action movie. Cool guys don't look at explosions. Cool guys don't look at explosions. I couldn't help it. I looked. I was glad I did. The dragon's momentum coupled with his weight had left streak marks 10 meters long in the dirt. The impact hadn't been kind to the corpse either. Crumpled and broken, shafts of white bone stuck from the wings, which were nearly fractured beyond distinction. Its neck had folded over itself and under its body, nearly decapitating it. Seeing the carnage, the reality of what I had just done came crashing back to me. I sat down for a moment, rethinking what I had just done. I hadn't even been scared, even though I'd known I could have died. Was that normal? My introspections were interrupted when I got a face full of dirt from an anti-tank pulse striking the ground right in front of me. Choking on earth, I dropped to the ground. Apparently my squad hadn't been the only ones in my audience. I guess jumping 8 meters into the air and killing a dragon tends to draw a crowd. Too bad this new crowd sympathized with the dragon rather than me. 3 tanks charged my position, death ray guns charging, red light spilling from the cannon's open maws. They never had the chance to fire. 3 dragons fell from the sky like bolts from the hand of a dragon-slinging Zeus, bearing their full weight against the tops of the offending tanks, the seemingly sturdy armor folded under the drakes as if they were no more than aluminium cans. I couldn't understand the sudden change of amicability the dragons were showing me until another 4 landed behind me. I got to look into the eyes of one of the first 3. I had killed one of their own. I was their kill. You know how in action movies, when the protagonist is up against impossible odds, the bad guys play it fair and let him fight them one at a time, while the rest just kind of swing their weapons around in the background? Apparently the dragons didn't subscribe to that playbook. 3 attacked at once, 2 in front, 1 just peeking out from my blind side. There might have been more coming from behind me, so I jumped the only direction I could. Up. I wish I could say that they all comically smashed into each other, where they probably lay dazed upon the ground while stars swirled around their heads. These buggers had reflexes though. 8 meters up is a long way, but they could jump farther. Following like Scout homing missiles, my 3 attackers jumped to beat me. They didn't make it. Mid-flight, the 2 charging from the front exposed in bursts of red light, as the third was thrown off course by a hailstorm of anti-tank ray pulses. My squad had arrived. Our small fight exploded into chaos. Yrrol was beside himself with frustration. The battle had been progressing flawlessly, but now the Alliance's advances stalled when they were so close to victory. Commander was gibbering about some sort of cowardice and so many garbled transmissions it was impossible to understand what they were upset about. Units were being lost all over the field, and now the Volza were out of control. Only 3 seconds ago, 3 tanks had broken formation, their crews screaming unintelligibly through the comms about the Dominion scum and a facade, when a pod of Volza came roaring from the sky to flatten the 3 deviants. Yrrol had been unable to believe his eyes. This had never happened before. Sure, in their excitement the Volza were known to kill an Alliance infantry squad or 2 who were foolish enough to get too close, but they had never attacked Celsi vehicles before. That was trained into them from birth. More Volza landed in the clearing created by their brothers, and Yrrol noticed the figure of the reptile's intent. A single soldier? They've attacked their masters to kill a single soldier? The soldier wasn't a species he recognized. A mercenary at that? What could have possessed that? The little creature powered up by a personal anti-gravity device. He must have. The alien mercenary shot into the air, followed by 3 Volza. Thinking to take advantage of their distraction, a group of nearby rovers decided to eliminate the defective Volza. There weren't enough of them to eliminate the entire pod in one volley, and, presented with a new target, the remaining Volza leapt upon those foolish enough to attack them. Yrrol couldn't abandon loyal men to a fate as grim as being torn apart by a Volza. Fleas! Yrrol snapped to his communications officer. Tell the squad to attack the Volza rampaging out our 4 o'clock. I'm not leaving men to those monsters. A few clipped words was all it required to divert Yrrol's squadron of tanks to the fight, where they charged the monsters, core guns blazing. The situation deteriorated from there. I couldn't believe it. They were helping us. The enemy was firing on their own monsters. I thought I was screwed with the rest of my squad. The 4 dragons that hadn't attacked me had scattered our hoverhummers, but I hadn't been able to see what happened afterwards. My attention was distracted by the only one of my 3 attackers still alive. Enraged at the not-so-gentle push that denied him his vengeance, the dragon leapt at me. Classic dragon opening move, that. I've seen it 100 times before, maybe more like 4, and I was ready for it. I needn't have been. Unlucky lizard attacker number 3 exploded in between point A and point B. Whipping around, I saw an entire squadron of enemy tanks descending upon our melee. I prepared to attack, but then I noticed they weren't attacking me or my squad. They were helping us. What? Even... I wasn't going to complain though, and neither was my squad from the look of things. I don't know how much longer they would have lasted. They managed to stay in their hoverhummers, which was good, since I doubted the magical confusion field that seemed to make the enemy completely ignore our actions wouldn't last if they got a look at the people inside the crafts. Aside from staying in the hummers though, they hadn't accomplished much else. 2 were disabled thanks to dragons that had shredded their engine blocks or whatever it was that drove their whole hover component. Aside from the fact that we were surrounded by apparently friendly enemies, things were going pretty well. So well in fact that it was just about time for fate to throw another fastball our way, which arrived in the form of another clutch of dregs. Pandemonium reigned once more. I was, as per usual, a popular attraction as far as targets were concerned. 2 died for me. What the heck? It had worked once before. Jumping at the first one when it was a mere 7 meters above the ground, I jumped forward and under his tail, slicing his neck and chest as I passed. That was the intent, at least. I think I led a little too early with my scimitars and ended up getting his jaw and cheek, but I still got far enough into his head. Plowing into the ground, the unfortunate lizard was hit in the back by the second dragon, which had been coming at me from behind, crashing into the ground in the jumbled heap. His companion's body cushioned his fall, if metal hard scales can really said to be able to cushion anything, and he regained his feet, although unsteadily, and attacked me with a quick swipe of his claws. Crap. I prefer it when they're charging me. I jumped away from the first few swings, but wouldn't be able to manage it for long. The air on this planet was ridiculously thin, and while it was thick enough for me to keep my head clear, I couldn't keep up any kind of large physical exertion for long. I was already slowing. So was the dragon. In fact, he was having significantly more trouble than I was. Breathing great hefts of air, it didn't seem to be able to get enough. I knew the feeling. I was starting to experience it as well. Wanting to end this fight before both of us ended up passed out on the ground to be run over by a tank, I aimed a swing at his arm on his next pass. The dragon tried to avoid my attack but couldn't, and his appendage came off at the elbow. Roaring in pain, it exploded with new vigor. Frightened by its roaring right in my ear, so did I. Adrenaline-fueled and angry, or frightened in my case, we spent the next few minutes playing cat and mouse around the course of a tank. Guess which one was the mouse? Then he spoiled the sport by flipping the tank out of the way and throwing himself towards me, intending to knock me from my feet with a sweeping blow to my knees with his remaining foreleg. I blocked it with the edge of my lava scimitar. It turns out lava swords aren't really all that good at blocking. They tend to burn or cut off anything that touches their blade. T-Rex the dragon only succeeded in lopping off his other foreleg. Lucky for me too, since I doubted I would have taken two words being smashed by the momentum of his attack. As it was, I was still thrown off my feet as his arm, newly detached at the bicep, flew into my legs, apparently sweeping them out from under me and carrying me a good 50 centimeters back. Apparently dragons don't take well to becoming wyrens, and T-Rex, lacking the balance of his namesake, flopped on the ground, attempting to balance on the forelegs that, in proportion to his body, are a bit stubbier than a corgi's. The exertion had pushed me very nearly to the limit of my lungs, already straining to find more oxygen in this accursedly thin atmosphere, and I think I blacked out for a few seconds. When I regained full awareness, a tank had put Big T out of his misery, and several more clutches of dragons and squadrons of tanks had entered the clusterfuck around me.